The Texas sun beat down mercilessly as Jeremiah Iron Jaw McCriedi spat blood into the dust, his jaw hanging at an unnatural angle from the rifle butt that had shattered it. At 52, the former Texas Ranger had survived the Mexican War, countless outlaw raids, and 20 years of frontier justice. But he'd never expected to be bushwhacked and left for dead by his own nephew, betrayed for the crime of refusing to ignore the boy's descent into murder and mayhem. The pain radiated through his skull like liquid fire. Each heartbeat sent fresh waves of agony through his broken face. His hands, bound behind him during the beating, were raw and bleeding where the ropes had cut into his wrists. The taste of copper filled his mouth as he tried to breathe through the swelling. "You're finished, Uncle Jerry," Billy McCriedi had snarled after his gang worked the old Ranger over with boots and gun butts. "This territory don't need washed-up lawmen who can't tell the difference between justice and family loyalty." Billy stood over him, 26 years old and handsome in the way of predators, all lean muscle and sharp edges. The boy Jerry had taught to ride and shoot now looked at him with contempt, his eyes cold as a rattlesnake's. The 5 men who rode with him, hardened killers all, laughed as Jerry struggled to rise, only to be kicked back into the dirt. The family loyalty had been Billy's expectation that blood would protect him when he started robbing banks and killing innocent people. When Jerry discovered his nephew was leading the notorious Devil's Backbone gang, the boy had decided that a tragic accident would solve his problem permanently. "Should have looked the other way like a good uncle," Billy had laughed as they tied Jerry to his horse and sent it running toward the Badlands. "Maybe the Comanche will finish what we started." The memory of those words burned almost as much as Jerry's physical wounds. He'd raised Billy after his sister died, taught him everything he knew about tracking, shooting, and living by a code. Somewhere along the way, the boy had taken those skills and twisted them, using Jerry's lessons to become more efficient at cruelty. Now Jerry crawled through the mesquite and prickly pear, his broken jaw making every breath agony, his vision blurred from the beating. The thorns tore at his clothes and skin, adding fresh cuts to his collection of injuries. The sun overhead was merciless, baking the land and drawing precious moisture from his already dehydrated body. His tongue felt swollen, his lips cracked and bleeding. In the distance, he spotted a weathered adobe building beside a natural spring, the first sign of water he'd seen since his horse had finally thrown him hours earlier. The sight gave him strength to push forward, though each movement sent fresh pain shooting through his battered body. The cantina sat at the crossroads of 3 cattle trails, a place where vaqueros, drovers, and travelers could water their stock and themselves. The building was low and sturdy, built to withstand both the elements and the occasional violence that erupted when men drank too much after weeks on the trail. A wooden sign, weathered by sun and wind, hung above the door, though Jerry's vision was too blurred to read it. Jerry pushed through the batwing doors and collapsed onto the nearest chair, his blood pooling on the rough wooden floor. The room swam before his eyes, a blur of wooden tables, the gleam of bottles behind a bar, the startled faces of afternoon drinkers turning to stare at the bloody wreck of a man who just staggered in. "Santa Maria," came a woman's voice, sharp with concern and authority. Jerry looked up to see a woman in her mid-40s, her black hair streaked with silver, wearing the practical clothes of someone who worked hard for everything she owned. She moved with the confident grace of someone equally comfortable serving drinks or settling disputes with a shotgun. Her face showed the lines of someone who'd seen much of life's hardships but refused to be broken by them. This was Esperanza Hope Delgado, though Jerry wouldn't learn her full story until later. A woman who'd carved out her own kingdom in this lawless corner of Texas, where the nearest law was 100 miles away and justice was whatever the strongest person said it was. "What happened to you, viejo?" she asked, kneeling beside him to examine his injuries. Her hands were gentle but efficient as they probed his wounds, assessing the damage with the skill of someone who'd seen plenty of violence. Jerry tried to speak but only managed a gurgling sound through his shattered jaw. The effort sent fresh pain lancing through his face, and he tasted more blood. Hope's dark eyes hardened as she recognized the systematic nature of his beating. This wasn't random violence, but deliberate brutality. "Consuelo," she called to a young woman behind the bar. "Bring hot water and clean cloth, and fetch the bottle of laudanum from my room." The girl, no more than 16, with her mother's same determined eyes, nodded and disappeared through a door at the back of the cantina. The other patrons, sensing that Hope had taken charge of the situation, returned to their drinks, though they cast occasional curious glances at the broken man. "You're safe now," Hope told Jerry, her voice firm but kind. "Whoever did this to you won't find you here." For 3 days, Jerry drifted between consciousness and drug-induced sleep, while Hope tended his wounds with the skill of someone who'd patched up plenty of violence over the years. She reset his jaw as best she could, though it would never be quite right again, leaving him with a permanent slur that earned him his nickname. She cleaned the cuts, set the broken fingers on his left hand, and applied poultices to the deep bruises that covered most of his body. During his more lucid moments, Jerry became aware of the rhythms of the cantina. The quiet mornings when Hope and Consuelo cleaned and prepared for the day, the steady afternoon trade of travelers stopping for refreshment, the livelier evenings when locals gathered to drink and share news. Through it all, Hope maintained order with a quiet authority that required no shouting or threats, just the knowledge that her rules would be respected or consequences would follow. When Jerry finally sat up clear-headed, he found Hope cleaning rifles at a corner table, preparing for trouble that seemed to follow her like a shadow. Her cantina was busier than he'd expected. Not just drifters and desperados, but families, merchants, even a few well-dressed travelers who'd learned this was the safest stop between San Antonio and El Paso. The main room was larger than it had appeared when he'd first staggered in, with a long bar of polished mesquite wood, tables arranged to allow for both privacy and security, and windows positioned to catch the breeze while offering clear views of approaching riders. Everything spoke of careful planning by someone who understood both hospitality and survival. "You run quite an operation," he observed, his words slightly slurred but understandable. The effort of speaking sent dull pain through his jaw, but it was manageable now, a vast improvement over the searing agony of days before. "I run the only honest game in 300 miles, Hope replied without looking up from her work. "People know they can get a fair deal here, whether they're buying whiskey or information." Her hands moved with practiced efficiency as she reassembled a Winchester repeater, the metal parts clicking into place with satisfying precision. The story emerged slowly. Hope had been married to a wealthy rancher who'd been murdered by claim jumpers, leaving her with debts and enemies who wanted her land. Rather than flee or remarry, she'd sold everything and bought this cantina, turning it into the most successful business in the territory. "Men think a Mexican woman can't run a place like this," she explained, checking the loads in her pistols. "They learn different, or they don't learn at all." There was no bravado in her voice, just the matter-of-fact tone of someone stating an established truth. Jerry told her about Billy's gang, the betrayal, the years of honest service repaid with treachery. He described the slow corruption he'd witnessed in his nephew, the gradual shift from youthful wildness to calculated cruelty, the way money and power had twisted the boy's sense of right and wrong until family meant nothing compared to his ambitions. Hope listened without judgment, occasionally nodding as if she'd heard similar stories before. Her eyes, dark and perceptive, caught the pain behind Jerry's words, not just physical pain, but the deeper wound of betrayal someone he'd loved and raised. "This nephew of yours," she said finally, "he thinks family blood gives him the right to be a killer. He thinks I'm too old to stop him, too set in my ways to understand that times have changed." Jerry touched his broken jaw gingerly. "Maybe he's right about the old part." "Maybe he's right about one thing," Hope said, her tone thoughtful. "Maybe the old ways are finished. Question is, what are you going to build to replace them?" The question hung between them, challenging and profound. Jerry had spent his life upholding the law as he understood it, sometimes brutal, sometimes merciful, but always guided by a code that seemed increasingly out of place in a changing world. Hope had created something different, A place where justice wasn't about badges or guns, but about community and mutual protection. Their partnership began when a group of rustlers tried to steal cattle from the ranchers who used Hope's cantina as a meeting place. Jerry's knowledge of tracking and his experience with outlaw tactics proved invaluable in planning a response that recovered the stock without unnecessary bloodshed. They tracked the rustlers to a box canyon 20 miles south, where Jerry's understanding of ambush tactics allowed them to surprise the thieves and recover the cattle with minimal violence. One rustler died resisting, but the others surrendered when they realized they were outmaneuvered by people who knew the territory better than they did. "You still know your business," Hope observed as they watched the recovered cattle being driven back to their rightful owners. The ranchers had offered rewards, but Hope had negotiated a different arrangement: protection and supplies for her cantina in exchange for ongoing assistance with security. "No outlaws. Know the country, know how to read sign," Jerry replied, his slurred speech making him sound older than his years. "Out here? That's still worth something." He didn't add what they both understood, that his days of physical confrontation were likely over, but his mind remained sharp and his experience valuable. Word spread through South Texas about the cantina at Devil's Backbone, where Hope Delgado and the broken-down ranger could solve problems that stumped territorial authorities. Ranchers brought boundary disputes for mediation, merchants sought protection for valuable shipments, and ordinary folks came with problems that required discretion rather than official attention. They developed a reputation for fairness that extended from the Rio Grande to the hill country. Hope's Cantina became more than a way station. It became a place where justice could be found when courts were too distant or too corrupt to provide it. More importantly, they found in each other something they'd both thought lost: companionship, respect, and the slow-burning warmth of mature love built on shared struggles and mutual understanding. Neither spoke of it directly, but it grew in the quiet evenings when they sat together on the cantina's porch, watching the sunset paint the western sky in brilliant colors. Jerry's body healed as much as it ever would. His jaw remained crooked, his speech permanently slurred. 3 fingers on his left hand never regained their full dexterity, but he found new purpose in this partnership with Hope, using his knowledge to protect rather than pursue, to prevent violence rather than respond to it. The confrontation with Billy McCriedi's gang came 8 months later. They rode into the cantina's courtyard like conquering heroes, 6 men on fine horses, dressed in expensive clothes bought with blood money. They were confident that the old man they'd left for dead was long since buzzard bait. Jerry was helping a blacksmith repair a wagon wheel when the riders appeared. He recognized his nephew immediately. The same arrogant posture, the same cold eyes, the same casual cruelty in the way he treated his horse. "Well, I'll be damned," Billy called out, his voice carrying across the suddenly quiet cantina. "If it ain't Uncle Jerry, still breathing when he should be feeding the worms." The courtyard fell silent. Customers melted away from the newcomers, sensing the violence that hung in the air like the metallic scent before a thunderstorm. Hope appeared in the cantina doorway, her expression calm but her hand near the shotgun that was never far from reach. Jerry stepped forward. No longer the broken man they'd beaten and abandoned. Hard work had strengthened his body, while finding his true purpose had restored his spirit. His jaw was crooked and his speech slurred, but his eyes were clear and his hands steady. "Billy," he said calmly, his words slightly garbled but his meaning unmistakable. "You're looking prosperous. The murder business treating you well?" Billy's smile faltered slightly at his uncle's composure. He'd expected fear, or perhaps pathetic gratitude that Billy hadn't finished the job. Instead, he found himself facing a man who seemed oddly at peace despite, or perhaps because of, his disfigurement. "Don't get smart with me, old man. You should have stayed dead." "Should've, could've, would've," Jerry replied. "But here I am and here you are, and it's time to settle accounts." Billy's confidence wavered as he took in the changes in his uncle. The way Jerry stood, the calm certainty in his voice, the fact that he was clearly no longer alone. Hope emerged from the cantina with a shotgun, flanked by a dozen armed men who'd learned to respect the partnership that had brought peace to their corner of Texas. "This is family business," Billy snarled, his hand moving toward his gun. "No," Jerry replied, his slurred words carrying the authority of decades of law enforcement. "This is justice business, and justice don't care about blood when blood's been spilled innocent." The gunfight erupted without warning. Billy was fast, faster than Jerry had ever been even in his prime. But Jerry had learned something in 30 years of staying alive that Billy never would. Patience, positioning, and the wisdom to let your enemy make the first mistake. Billy's shot went wide in his eagerness to prove his superiority. Jerry's bullet took him center mass, dropping him in the dusty courtyard. As Billy lay dying, Jerry knelt beside him, his broken jaw making his words sound like a prayer. "You were family, boy," he said quietly, "but family don't excuse murder. Family don't excuse betrayal. And family sure don't excuse forgetting the difference between right and wrong." Billy McCriedi died with his eyes wide, finally understanding the lesson he'd learned too late. The Devil's Backbone gangs scattered after their leader's death, some fleeing to Mexico, others trying to go straight. The reign of terror that had plagued South Texas for 2 years ended in the dusty courtyard of Hope's cantina, brought down by an old ranger who'd refused to let blood ties override justice. "Deal better?" Hope asked as they watched the undertaker load Billy's body onto a wagon. "Feel older," Jerry admitted. "But yeah, better. Sometimes family's the hardest thing to let go of, even when it's gone bad." Their partnership deepened into something more profound than business or convenience. They expanded the cantina into a way station that served travelers throughout South Texas, providing not just supplies and shelter, but mediation services for disputes that might otherwise end in bloodshed. Together, they created a place where the law might be distant, but justice remained close at hand. Not the harsh frontier justice of hangman's nooses and vigilante possess, but something more measured and sustainable. They trained others in their methods, creating a network of fair-minded people who could resolve conflicts before they escalated to violence. "We make quite a team," Hope observed one evening as they sat on their porch, watching the sunset paint the Texas sky in brilliant oranges and purples. "We make a family," Jerry corrected, his slurred words somehow more eloquent than perfect speech. "The kind that's built on choice rather than chance, on respect rather than obligation." At 53, Jeremiah McCriedi was no longer the broken-down ranger who'd been beaten and left for dead by corrupt family. He was a peacemaker, a protector, and living proof that sometimes the hardest justice to dispense is the kind that involves people you love. The Badlands that had nearly claimed his life had instead given him purpose, partnership, and the chance to use his experience for something greater than mere survival. And Esperanza Delgado had found something she'd thought lost when her husband died. Not just love, but belonging with someone who understood that building something lasting required both strength and the wisdom to know when mercy was more powerful than vengeance. Together, they'd carved out their own piece of the American dream in the harsh beauty of South Texas, proving that sometimes the people society discards become the ones who build the most enduring peace. Their cantina became a legend on the frontier, Devil's Backbone Station, where justice was served alongside whiskey and where two people who'd been written off by the world proved that the strongest partnerships are forged in the crucible of betrayal, overcome, and trust rebuilt. The trails still ran past their door, carrying cattle and dreams across the expanding West. But now they carried something else as well. The knowledge that there were still places where right mattered more than might, where age was respected rather than dismissed, and where family was defined not by blood, but by the willingness to stand together when the chips were down.